Good morning, everyone. Very nice to see you all here. My name is Zach Burton. I'm the director here at the Princeton SPIA DC Center. I'm happy to see many new faces and also some very familiar ones as well. Just want to let everyone know we are streaming this event. So greetings also and welcome to all those watching online. We're delighted to be hosting the U.S.-Japan Forum here today with our partners from the Japan Economic Foundation. They have been a great partner to us here, and John will speak a little bit more about that. I want to thank them and their staff, as well as my own team for putting on today, and we hope you enjoy it. Though there are certainly many obstacles to navigate at this juncture in the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think we can safely say the relationship has also thrived. Thrived both bilaterally and multilaterally. I can say that myself. I previously came from the Biden administration and worked very closely with Japanese colleagues in New York at the UN on a whole host of issues. Again, not just in that region, but around the world. So I'm delighted to see some of those colleagues here as well as online. I will just move now. I think we're all set up here for our first panel, but before that, I want to introduce you to the co-hosts for today from both Princeton University and the Japan Foundation, Mr. Masakazu Toyota. Thank you so much for being here, and to your team for all the work. And of course, our own John Eikenberry, Professor of Politics and International Affairs, a leading scholar of international relations and the author of many books. He needs no real introduction here. He was one of my own professors, and I know that's true for many of you. So thank you all again for being here, and John, over to you.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Zach. It's really great to be here and to team up with SPIA DC and Jacob as well, who's been a great member of your team, Zach. So this is just a beautiful place to get together. And to get together, many of us are in one way or another connected to Princeton, but we're still, I think, in a kind of inaugural phase of this center here in DC. 2 years ago, I ran a conference very much on the topic of making the world safe for economic nationalism, very much a precursor to our topic today. But it's a great chance to collaborate with the Japan Economic Foundation. It is truly a collaboration. On the Princeton side, it's Princeton, SPIA, and then specifically the Center for International Security Studies, which I co-direct with my dear colleague, Aaron Friedberg, who's on the panel today. So we are both here in force. This event would not happen, we would not be here without Masakazu Toyota. Mr. Toyota, the chairman and CEO of JEF, after a very long and distinguished career in Japanese METI and other ministerial posts, he has been the leader of JEF now for some years. But most importantly, everything you could say about him is important, but the most important thing about Mr. Toyota is that he is an alum of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson School, class of 1979. So I think he probably trumps many of you in this venue. We first really met in earnest last October at an alumni event in Tokyo at the International House of Japan, where we had 100 or more Princetonians from Japan and Tokyo area, and we had a wonderful conversation, and in some sense the rest is history. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Toyota to make his opening remarks, just to say that we're really glad to have you all here. We do have an incredibly important topic, the future of U.S.-Japan cooperation. In many ways, this meeting and organizing it is a microcosm, I don't know, synecdoche for the larger U.S.-Japan relationship. So navigating our own kind of collaboration today in this space speaks to the larger challenge of collaboration and opportunities of collaboration between our two countries. So without further ado, Mr. Toyota.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Kazu Toyoda. No connection with Toyota family, unfortunately. I am chairman of Japan Economic Foundation, as Professor Eikenberry explained to you. Thank you very much for coming to join us today at the U.S.-Japan Forum, which we started more than 2 decades ago. And by collaborating with universities and economic think tanks, not only in the United States, but also in EU and in Asian countries, in order to promote communication between Japan and many other countries. This year, I'm so happy to co-host this forum with Princeton University. As Professor Eikenberry explained to you, I studied in Princeton. I wouldn't say how many years ago, but he referred. A few years ago, I'd say, maybe a few decades ago. That is true. JEF was established in 1981. So this is attempting to communicate with many other countries and sending our own message of Japan, which we think the Japanese message, and try to promote the collaboration. I think that is quite important. And we have 3 pillars. One is publishing a sort of journal. It used to be a journal as a paper, but at this moment, clearly, it's simply a web, a sort of communication, but we call it Japan Spotlight. And I hope you could see this Japan Spotlight through our homepage. It's free, no charge. So please have a look at that whenever you have time. And the second mission is to co-host such a forum with many countries, and that is quite important, particularly when we had rather friction with the United States. This was very important. At this moment, more cooperation is important, and I really think this sort of communication is quite important. And the third one, the last one, is to set up a study group with many experts on various issues. And the most important or recent study group was set up to promote free trade under, I hope, Mr. Trump's administration. He would eventually like free trade. I don't know whether it is true, but with many American scholars and European scholars and Asian scholars, about 15 people. And it is already on our website, so I hope you will have a chance to have a look at that. And promoting free trade arrangement is quite important. Throughout our long history of almost half a century, as I told you, conducting projects like these, world economic situation has changed dramatically. It is true. Well, sadly, we are encountering a world without rules and orders. We see obvious rise of authoritarian leaders expanding their territory, enforcing economic, political, and military powers. Russia's invasion into Ukraine and the other conflict, China's economic confrontation, etc., etc. There are many issues, and last week the United Nations celebrated its 80th year of establishment. The General Assembly, Mr. Ishiba, Prime Minister, attended the meeting and delivered a speech during the general debate referring to Japan, which has served for the world lasting peace, stressed the partnership and collaboration, then rather division, tolerance over conflict. Under the prevailing uncertain world, Japan and the United States as allied countries need to pursue this philosophy. I sincerely hope that the President of Japan, ruling developing Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, will ultimately become the Prime Minister of Japan, who will be elected tomorrow. Will also following this path, peace and collaboration. There was another hot news of President Trump's possibility to paying a short visit to Japan on his way to APEC summit in Korea. This will immediately become the first and crucial meeting for the next leader of our country. Nobody knows who will be, but I'm sure he will have a good meeting with the new Prime Minister. I do hope they also will reconfirm the lines of thoughts which I explained to you. Topics we will be discussing in the session today are therefore extremely timely, especially in the time of our new leaders in Japan. This time, we have asked experts in Japan-U.S. relationship, representative Japanese business circle, and government officials to join this lively discussion. I truly wish to make this important occasion to draw some realistic solutions, just not debates. Or I really would like to have a solution for this sort of problem. And I hope you could enjoy and learn quite a lot. And this is really what Princeton University has been doing. And I learned quite a lot. Thank you very much. So please enjoy. Thank you.
I'm going to segue and turn things over to my dear friend Kate McNamara from Georgetown University, but you see that she's wearing Princeton orange, so thank you, Kate. She does have a connection as well. Just on format, we've asked our speakers to keep their initial comments to about 5 minutes, and Kate will be doing the signaling, if you will, as you always know it happens. But then we really do hope to have an interactive event, so please be prepared to engage. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So what an interesting set of conversations we're going to have this morning. I'm particularly pleased to be moderating this panel because the panel is really sort of, the organizers gave the panelists the kind of brief of thinking about the new world we're in terms of market activism becoming something that's very visible and legitimate across all kinds of different states that previously, right, thought in much more kind of, perfect competition, neoliberal sort of terms, right? So we're seeing this big switch happening in the place that I tend to think about the most, the EU, but also obviously in the US and in other places. And I think one thing that's been left out of that conversation about that switch is the role that international cooperation amongst allies who see the world very similarly, who have similar goals, the role that that kind of international cooperation might play in reinforcing these efforts at reshaping economies to be more competitive, to be more innovative, to be more resilient, and more robust. And I think that Japan has a long history of developing its own economy in all kinds of innovative and important ways. And so I think there's much that the US can learn from Japan, but I think too there's much that Japan can hopefully partner with the United States in order to move forward in the 20th century economy and the 20th century geopolitical landscape. So that's a big kind of set of issues to delve into, but I'm really looking forward to our speakers who have a vast array of knowledge across academic issues, across public policy issues, across business issues, most of them having sort of moved in and out of these different spaces themselves. So I'm certain we're going to have some really interesting ideas being put forth from our various speakers. We are just going to go in the order that we're in the program, and I am going to try to keep everyone to about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments. So we'll start out with Professor Mariko Watanabe to start us off.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And it's really an honor to be here to start this session. And I myself is a researcher on Chinese economy, and the first visit to China was 1992, just after the Deng Xiaoping's South tour. I don't know whether you know this story or not, but after 40 years, everything has changed. And today I'd like to propose idea to the current the solution for current situation as a scale, harm of scale. So what does that mean? I will talk two things. One is about the industrial policies, and everyone has studied industrial policy last 5 or 6 years, but actually China has a long history since 1993. They have a very clear idea. And actually, the strength of their economic power does not come from subsidies or SOEs, nor there's very smooth industrial linkage. And that is one form of scale economy. And as Kate has just pointed out, a very good concept that she just mentioned that the perfect competition in international trade system has already almost come to end, or that we are now in trouble. But I think scale economy is a source of imperfect competition. And imperfect competition has some troubles. It is very widely known issues in domestic one market economies, and economics has already had the very substantial idea. But in the internationally speaking, we do not have some kind of international competition law or international remedy for international imperfect competition. So now is a time to we start think and discussing about this. And firstly, I want to stress that the China's strength does not come from subsidy or SOEs again, and that comes from their linkages. And the linkages has established gradually in last 30 years. And the core of their strength is, I call that catalog-based industrial policy. So Chinese government has published the industrial guide catalog every 5 years. And the latest one is the last one, 2024. So they are published their list constituted of encouraged industries and restricted industry and prohibited industries. The current version they have 5 industries for encouragement, and 10 should be restricted one, and 5 is prohibited one. And if you precisely looking over that, they propose 70 sub-industries for semiconductors only. So I think they are well documented to how to make industrial linkage more effectively. So actually that is a source of their power. And they are now thinking to various direction, or space, or quantum computing, or something. But I think if you want to compete with China, actually they are go far beyond, far away from us. So I think that is the actual situation. And the secondary, so I think we need some governance, new governance for the scale. And actually, the very, very smooth industrial linkage itself is a very good economic situation. The problem is that sometimes they tend to be abuse their power of scale. For example, you may know that economic cohesion situation or something. So actually, they are intentionally or unintentionally use or abuse the power of scale. So that is a point. That is a problem for us. So I'd like to propose to build up some new governance structure against the harm of scale. So I pointed 4 points. One is a very simple one. So we are not we should discipline the export with deficit. If your country industrial-wise, some industry deficit, and then the product export to another country, that is very harmful behavior. So we need to discipline that. The second one is that we had better to introduce some scale differentiated disciplines against excessive economic cohesion. And the third one is a scale differentiated anti-dumping CBD or safeguard, that kind of trade rescue guard system. The fourth one is that we need to build up some established international competition law or international competition policy framework to provide some discipline who abuse their power of scale. That is my point.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. Next, we'll move on to Teruko Wada for her comments.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank JEF and Princeton University for inviting to me this great discussion today. And in front of all this audience and being streamlined, I'm very nervous, actually. So I have to be careful not to say something stupid. But anyway, let me first introduce what Keidanren is. Many of you here may not be familiar with our organization. Keidanren is a Japanese business association. We are a membership organization composed of more than 1,500 major Japanese businesses, but also some foreign businesses who are doing business in Japan. So we are a quite extensive economic organization, and we join the policy discussion with the Japanese government. But there's a kind of common misunderstanding that Keidanren, Japan Business Association, is affiliated with the government. But actually, no, we are not a government affiliation. We are financially independent from the government, and also we are run solely from the membership fee from our member companies. So that's how we maintain a political independence, but also we work very closely with the government so that we can realize the policies that Japanese businesses strive to achieve. So today I'm going to speak on behalf of myself only, so I'm not speaking for Keidanren, so there's no misunderstanding for that. So today I would like to speak from the perspective of Japanese industry on the delicate balancing act that we are facing between protecting critical technologies and reinforcing resilient supply chains and preserving open rules-based global trade regime. These goals are not mutually exclusive, but achieving them simultaneously requires careful calibration and international cooperation, as you just rightly mentioned. Japan stands at a strategic crossroads. To be candid, complete decoupling from China is practically impossible. China remains deeply embedded in the global supply chain. It is both a key production base and a major consumer market. And Japanese firms, like their American counterparts, they recognize the economic significance of this interdependence. At the same time, Rising geopolitical tensions have exposed vulnerabilities, especially in semiconductors, rare earth, and battery materials. Japanese companies are increasingly mindful of the challenges posed by deferring export controls or the investment screening procedure. When these measures are not well aligned, they can create compliance burdens and risk undermining the very resilience we seek to build. That's why allied coordination is essential. Harmonizing trade and technology policies among like-minded countries is not just a strategic imperative, but it's rather a practical necessity. Shared standards and trust frameworks can help protect sensitive technologies while enabling secure collaboration across the borders. There are also tremendous opportunities for US-Japan cooperation. Joint initiatives in semiconductor R&D, AI governance, or energy security, or critical minerals can reinforce our technological leadership. Coordinated efforts to diversify supply chains, especially through Indo-Pacific partnership, can reduce overdependence and enhance stability. And platforms for industry dialogue can help align strategic priorities and reduce frictions. Importantly, Japanese businesses have been the #1 foreign investor in the United States for 6 consecutive years, since 2019. And actually, we have Keidan published a brochure explaining about the contribution made by the Japanese businesses in the United States that explains how much they have invested for how many years and how many jobs they have created throughout the countries. And I have put a one-pager at the front desk so that you can pick it up with a QR code so that you can go to the website for this brochure. I put so much effort in this, so I just want to make sure that you bring this back and you can access it from your PC when you go back home. So I want to emphasize the appetite to invest in the United States is very strong among Japanese businesses. United States continues to be the #1 favorite market to do business. At the same time, the long-term investment decision benefit greatly from a policy environment that offers predictability and stability. When businesses can plan with confidence, they are better positioned to contribute to shared economic and strategic goals. In closing, I want to mention that Japan remains committed to partnering with the United States and other allies to promote secure, resilient, and innovative industrial ecosystem. We must do so with a clear-eyed understanding of global economic interdependence and the shared commitment to shaping a future that is both competitive and cooperative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll move on to Chris Kennedy.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk about this important topic. So I wanted to challenge some of the premises in the description of this panel because I do think we're living in this environment right now where the current Trump administration hasn't really laid out a fully coherent vision for the US-China relationship. There's certainly some camps that are very focused on restricting China's access to technology. There are other camps, as we've seen in the news, that are interested in creating markets for US technology firms. The same goes with trade policy. And so I want to focus on a few areas where I think there are real opportunities for cooperation between Japan and the US, and to Mr. Toyoda's point, some concrete examples. So I served in the Biden administration and then into the Trump administration. Now I'm at Bloomberg Economics. My research is focused on informing investors about what's happening geopolitically, geoeconomically, and how they should be making their longer-term strategic decisions based on that information and hopefully the insights we're providing. As we've seen, President Biden took a big dive into industrial policy in the previous administration. It was a huge shift, and now we're seeing another shift. President Biden, I think, did a great job trying to set up sort of a structure of subsidies and other support for critical industries. The Trump administration, as some have called it, sort of state capitalism with American characteristics, different terminology. But the point is, there's a lot more direct investment with specific companies. And I think a lot of corporate America is concerned about getting on the wrong side of the administration. And in some ways, I think that that's not a bad thing. I think under President Biden, we saw auto OEMs in the US willing to take the subsidies, but didn't really invest too much in de-risking, weren't so interested in the longer term objectives. I saw this quite a bit in critical minerals. And so I wanted to focus on that specific example here and rare earths, because I do think that that provides a really great opportunity for collaboration. So rare earths were in the news earlier this year. For those who don't know, these are essential inputs to many technologies, defense, industrial, semiconductors, everything of the future. Well, Japan, as many of you know, in 2010 experienced a significant disruption from Chinese restrictions on exports. And I have to say, in reviewing the history, I think Japan did a pretty good job of de-risking some of their supply chains. Despite being an island with not many resources domestically, they made big moves. They invested in Linus, an Australian company. They continue to invest in Linus. They worked with industrial majors in Japan to set up a stockpiling system, both a national level stockpile and then a private company stockpile system. And as a result, they reduced their dependence on China from about 90% to 60%. Still quite a bit, but it's substantially better than what we've done over the intervening 15 years. And I do think that as we look at what the US has done over the past several months, notably with the investment in MP, we're seeing a sort of similar, much more close collaboration with specific companies in the United States. And I think Japan has a lot of knowledge, technology, and understanding of the Chinese industrial stack to share with us as we attempt to build on that and make sure that this actually has a long-term impact on our ability to de-risk certain supply chains. So I think that that's one really great example of cooperation that we potentially have. I do think that there's going to be some challenges. So there's been a lot of talk about this $550 billion investment fund that our Japanese colleagues, you're so lovely giving the administration, right, to invest in the projects of Secretary Howard Lutnick's choosing. Obviously, this is going to be really challenging. Japan's a market economy. You can't force your companies to invest in certain projects, but I do think there are some real opportunities there. I mean, Japan's long history of investing in the United States, creating great jobs across the country. Some of the best auto companies. I just bought a Toyota Tacoma a few months ago. I love it. It's the best car I've ever had. But also the investment in Nippon Steel. I mean, there's a real opportunity there for knowledge sharing, and I think there is no other company in the world that could have come in and made that investment with the expectation of actually turning it into a really profitable enterprise. And I think that just shows the unique comparative advantage that Japan has as a partner for the United States. I do think that as we move forward, just to speak about a little bit more about the, I don't want to say schizophrenic, but maybe inconsistent policies that the administration is putting forward. On the one hand, trade deficit's so important. On the other hand, we want hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars of investment flowing in. These things don't really balance when we think about capital accounts and balance of payments. So I do think that it's really important for Japan, if we're going to try to pursue both objectives, maybe a little bit of rebalancing of the trade relationship, but also delivering on investment commitments, to think about export markets, to make sure that Jameson Greer doesn't get too upset over too much money flowing in without exports going out. And so it's going to be a tightrope, but I do think the specific industries where there are real opportunities for additional engagement, again, in minerals and rare earths, Japan, and it's alluded to this, but outside of China, Japan is really the only opportunity to help the U.S. build out the whole rare earth stack, from mining to refining to separation to magnet production, and that's a true opportunity. I think with steel production and some of the other major industrial areas where Japan still has a really significant domestic presence. So I'm going to leave it there and just say that I do think that Japan is probably better positioned than any of our bilateral partners. And let's be very clear, you know, this administration cares about bilateral relationships. I don't think we're going to see a lot on the multilateral front, at least in the near term. I think Japan is probably better positioned than any of our partners to really to position well in the U.S. economy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Aaron Friedberg.
Thank you very much, Kate, and let me join in welcoming all of our Japanese friends and colleagues here. The topic of our panel is U.S.-Japan cooperation on technology and industrial policy. And cooperation is certainly desirable in the abstract, but policies should be part of a strategy. And a strategy should be informed by a goal or a vision. And as regards the economic dimension of our, as the EU described it in 2019, our systemic rivalry with China, I don't think we currently have one, either separately, US and Japan, or collectively. That was not always the case. At the end of the Cold War, the advanced industrial democracies, led by the United States, attempted to create a fully integrated, open global economic system. That was a noble experiment. It was premised on the assumption that integration would promote the economic and political liberalization of the former Soviet Union, the former Soviet Empire, and also, above all, of China. That experiment has now clearly failed. I think that's the thing that's begun to sink in the last 10 years or so. China has not been transformed politically, and it's pursuing mercantilist trade and industrial policies that, thanks to the size of its economy, threaten the security and the future prosperity of others. And the examples are now obvious and numerous. Dominance of critical supply chains for a wide array of intermediate goods, rare earth elements, pharmaceutical ingredients, the components that go into drones, legacy chips, evidently targeted now by the CCP. China is pushing forward and attempting to gain a dominant position in a variety of new and emerging industries, electric vehicles, industrial robots, quantum, if they can, biotechnology. And its policies have contributed over time and are still contributing to an erosion in others' manufacturing capacity and to an increasingly lopsided distribution of industrial power. And if the United Nations estimates are correct, by 2030, China will account for 45% of global industrial production. And that would be unlike anything that we've seen since the United States was in a roughly equivalent position of dominance at the end of the Second World War. I think the thing that has become clear, or I hope it has become clear in the last few years, is that the CCP regime has no intention of changing course, no intention of doing what all right-thinking economists in the United States and also in China, some of them, have advocated for years, namely relying more on consumption rather than exports and investments to sustain growth. We've tried to persuade our Chinese counterparts, we've tried to coerce them into doing so, and without success. So, it seems to me, we're going to have to defend ourselves. The United States and Japan, together with the nations of the European Union and a handful of other advanced industrial democracies, need to work together to create what I described elsewhere as a trade defense coalition. And this would be a partial, as opposed to global, liberal trading system. It would be an integrated system with minimal barriers to flows of goods, capital, and data among the members, but common restrictions on such flows with China. That's a very crude sketch, but that's the general idea. And I should note that a system or a subsystem like this is not without precedent. It would resemble, in some respects, the one that grew up among the democracies during the Cold War. This is a second best outcome, and there's no point pretending otherwise. It will have costs and inefficiencies. It already is having those effects. But it seems to me that it's clearly preferable to any of the available alternatives, especially a world in which the United States and its allies become increasingly divided from one another and try to deal with China separately rather than collectively. My colleague framed the problem, I thought, quite nicely, saying Japan is trying to achieve or trade off among these objectives, developing critical technologies, greater resilience, and also preserving an open rules-based system. And I think in order to do the first two, we're going to have to sacrifice on the third, at least insofar as a global system is concerned. Given the current direction of US policy, obviously the question is how do we get there from here? And fortunately I'm out of time, but I just want to make two very broad suggestions. The first, which I suppose is obvious but worth saying, the first is do no harm on both sides. Both in the United States and Japan, it's possible to imagine courses of action which will make this much worse, which will deepen the divisions between our two countries and limit the chances of succeeding along the lines that I've described. And the second, again, just a sort of general concept, is sort of like the notion in counterinsurgency warfare of an inkblot strategy. Build outwards from areas where cooperation is possible now and hope to build toward this larger goal that I described. And I think we can see some areas in which this could be possible, and in some cases we've begun to make progress, or we had begun to make progress in this direction. Some kinds of common tariffs or protective barriers on some Chinese goods to deal with this problem of overcapacity and the massive scale that currently China enjoys. Developing alternative sources of supply in some of these critical intermediate goods. And just thinking about the politics of this, where it is clearly impossible for the United States to do this kind of thing at home, it ought to be possible to cooperate with others, even in an administration that has a preference for going it alone. Coordination on export controls, again, something on which progress had been made, and defense industrial cooperation, shipbuilding being one area where the United States is in great need of assistance. The development of mass-produced, low-cost, unmanned or uncrewed weapon systems, which require significant industrial manufacturing capacity, would be another area. So it seems to me there are lots of possibilities, but I do think we have to have our eye on a goal. Otherwise, we're just going to be going from one problem to another and not advance in a direction that serves our interests individually and collectively over time. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, speakers. Everyone was very circumspect in keeping to their time, which is extraordinary. But at the same time, I think everyone sort of laid down different kinds of markers in this conversation, and I really appreciated that. I think Mariko really kind of pointed to the need, but the complexities as well, of new governance forms, right, in terms of thinking about international cooperation and sort of, I think both of our Japanese speakers, you know, with their deep, deep knowledge of China and China's industrial policy and its the reliance on China that all of the Western economies share, you know, point to those strains and those trade-offs. I think that Teruko really did a nice job, as Aaron was saying, in focusing on the trade-offs, but she cautioned decoupling from China is impossible, right? So sort of set that down as something we need to work with. Chris, I think, really gave us an invaluable view of sort of how to think about the Trump administration, because I think that's one thing that some of us IR scholars have struggled with, in the sense of, you know, the Trump administration's foreign policy not adhering to, you know, what we have generally understood to be the different templates for American foreign policy over the years. And sorting through and sort of making this interesting argument that maybe it's okay that corporate America is worried about getting on Trump's wrong side, which I took to be that it gives him a certain amount of power and leverage over the direction that those companies are taking, which in this new world might be necessary and more efficacious. And then finally, Aaron, of course, I think came out swinging very correctly with, let's sort of step back and think about what is all this in the service of. When we do think about foreign policy, it's really important to make the question of goals and the strategies serving those goals front and center. And again, I think that's been one of the problems that we've had in figuring out sort of where America has been going since January. And I think inconsistency was the nice word that you used. So those are all the things that I was hearing, but I would love now to turn it over to the audience for questions and comments, picking up on really any of the threads that we've been weaving here on this panel. So I'll open it up. So, great. And if you could introduce yourself, please, when you speak. Yeah. I think all of us professors are very good at speaking extremely loudly. So I know Dan Dresner will not have a problem with that. But
can everyone hear me? Thanks, Kate. Daniel Dresner, Fletcher School. I have one question for Ms. Wada and one question for Craig. On the point about Japanese foreign direct investment in the United States, I certainly take your point. There's a long and distinguished history on this. I'm wondering whether there is any concern, given the recent ICE raids on the Hyundai plant in Georgia, about whether or not those sorts of actions will have a chilling effect on Japanese FDI, given that it could potentially have the same effect on South Korean FDI. And then on the question about your point about the Biden industrial policy, where the subsidies were, at least in the case of rare earths, didn't nudge the private sector enough. I'm wondering, and you can disabuse me of this notion, it does seem like the subsidies did work in semiconductors and investment in green technology. So what I'm wondering is, why was it that rare earths didn't work as well?
If I may add on, actually, to Professor Dresner's questions, I'm also curious about if you could speak a little bit about how Japanese business is thinking about these things. And again, sort of off the record, not in your official capacity, but give us a kind of general sense. Yeah, whatever. Professor Dresner noted about the ICE raids, and I'm curious, it's obviously an incredibly challenging time, which I think, is one of the reasons when you're talking about advising these folks, I'm like, can you advise me on my portfolio? Because who knows, right, what exactly is going on with the American economy and its long-term outlooks and so on. But I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about how Japanese businesses are adjusting, and I assume there is probably nimbleness in the way they are doing that. So maybe the ICE question is a sort of opening to that. Thank you.
Thank you for the very sensitive and interesting question. I'm on the live streaming, so. But interestingly, you may be surprised, but actually, no Japanese companies came to me about these visa issues. Interestingly, but not surprisingly to me, actually. The Japanese companies are trying very hard to follow the regulations on visas. And when they open up their factories, for example, of course they want to bring as many people as possible, but because of the visa issuing is very costly and it takes time, so they carefully select the necessary people to bring to the United States, and they train here with a proper visa. They don't bring the workers from Japan. They try to train the workers here locally, and also, if they are possible, they will bring the American people, the newly hired, back to Japan and train them in Japan, which is a very costly operation, but still, that's the way Japanese companies are trying to abide by the visa regulations, at the same time securing the enough workforce to sustain the production there. Actually, I recently visited the Fujifilm factory in North Carolina. They have like 700 people working in the factory, but only 3 Japanese expats in the on the site. So that's how the Japanese companies operate here. They try to employ as many as possible locally, and the workforce shortage is a serious concern among Japanese businesses because of the low unemployment rate, and the skilled workforce or skilled engineers are needed everywhere. So the Japanese companies working very closely with the local community colleges or universities to make sure they have an ample pipeline of the people. They come up with a program to train the high school students or college students with the specific technology skills that are required at the factory. So it takes time and it is costly, but that's the kind of cost and investment that Japanese companies are making so that they can avoid the visa issues that many other factory companies are facing. So I just want to emphasize that even though you have a much more relaxed visa regulation, I'm sure Japanese companies may want to bring more to encourage more investment, especially at the starting up process, at the early stage of the factory building. You would need more Japanese workers to do the business here. So if we can have a kind of new type of visa to encourage investment, that is something that we're happy to discuss.
Chris? A question about didn't the Biden administration actually in other arenas move the ball very far forward in the green transition and semiconductors?
Sure. So I'll say that a lot of the subsidy programs, a lot of the policies that were put forth by the Biden administration didn't actually focus on rare earths or other minor metals that China ended up restricting. We did focus on these issues at the end of the administration. I actually agree that the Chips and Science Act was pretty effective at bringing some new semiconductor manufacturing to the United States. I would push back a little bit on the green energy side of things. I think especially when it comes to battery materials, we saw a huge focus in the IRA and to a certain extent in the BIL, the infrastructure law, on this issue, but especially in the IRA, focused on de-risking our battery supply chains. I think a few things happened to prevent the sort of investment that we hoped for. We did see some investment, but I can tell you there was a lot of frustration with the slow pace of it. Some of that might have been process, but some of it was the way that the policy was structured. And then, of course, some of it was the fact that we saw the prices of these materials continue to decline due to structural overcapacity, continued investment by the Chinese. In fact, by the end of the administration, we were showing that even with the $7,500 subsidy for new EVs, that was part of the IRA, Chinese batteries were actually, they made up the difference in terms of their lower cost. That's a real challenge to overcome. I think another thing we saw was that OEMs and other big companies weren't confident that if Trump retook office, those subsidies would persist, and they were right. They were right. So I do think that there was a challenge there. In working, on some of the IRA implementation, we saw companies continuously push back on, the need to relax some of the foreign entity of concern rules to be able to continue, for instance, to purchase graphite from Chinese sources. And this was frustrating because at the same time, we were investing in companies to diversify. These companies were unwilling to commit to offtake from US projects. So are we actually going to see a difference now? So if we can move back to rare earths. We dealt with a little bit of this at the end of the administration, but the hammer didn't really drop on rare earths until this new administration. What we dealt with more was gallium and germanium. That was a huge focus. And I think we did make some progress there. In the case of these minor metals, so gallium, germanium, and then rare earths, this is, as an economist, it's challenging to say this, but I don't know that there's market solutions to de-risking these supply chains. The economies of scale are such, and the costs of recovering these materials, it just does not create a situation where you can have a really competitive landscape. You really do need either a few firms, or maybe even in the case of gallium, one company, Tech Resources up in Canada, can recover enough gallium to supply all of North America. So does it make sense to even try to foster a really competitive landscape? the thing we were dealing with these, the minor metals, so there's one institution in the U.S. government that's really well set up to do like directed industrial policy, and that's DoD, through the DLA.
For decades.
Yeah, and the Defense Production Act. But DoD has historically been extremely resistant to using its authorities to support the broader industrial base. I do think we're seeing a shift there. The Deputy Secretary Feinberg at DoD, clearly with this MP investment, has made a decision that DoD is willing to subsidize or at least invest in companies that are going to supply the broader industrial base. Is this a good deal? I have real doubts about MP being able to deliver. They've never produced a magnet. I think Linus is a better company. This is my personal view. But MP has the benefit of having an entirely North American supply chain, which is exceptionally very attractive to this administration. So we'll see. I'm actually quite heartened by the willingness to use these really powerful authorities to support our broader industrial base, but I have real questions about the specific companies that are being chosen. We've now seen MP, we've seen Intel, we've seen Lithium Americas, which, I mean, you read their press release, it's like something out of a mafia movie or something, right? We're getting our loan disbursement in exchange for 5%. Is this the way to do this sort of policy? I don't think so. But it's still good to see DoD being willing to step into the broader industrial arena.
One of my favorite books is a book called The Code by Margaret O'Mara. If you are not familiar with it, it's a history of Silicon Valley that really traces out the intersection of DoD, Stanford University, and these, brilliant tech entrepreneurs, and, says that basically you can't boil it down to one or the other. It's really about this sort of long-standing relationship between all of the above for thinking about technology and innovation. And it's written like a novel. It's really fun to read. Okay, more questions and comments from the audience. John.
Yeah, a great panel. I was just going to just follow up on Aaron's comments and ask you, looking at U.S.-Japan cooperation in this kind of strategic economic space over the years and decades, are there any templates or prototypes or examples where the two countries, either during the Cold War or afterwards, have done well on coordinating industrial policy, export controls, aligning subsidies in emerging technologies? Is there an example of where it's been done right between the two countries that you think could be built on or used as an inspiration for this larger trade security coalition?
My short answer to that is I don't know. It's something I would be interested in examining a little bit more. My impression, based on my somewhat limited knowledge of how this was done during the Cold War, is that there was success in coordinating export controls, at least in some areas. There were also some notable areas of disagreement and failure that led to tension. But I do think by the end of the Cold War, progress had been made on machine tools that the Soviets were trying to buy, and perhaps also in some areas in semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing. But it's worth examining more. I would say also, just in following up on the comment that was just made, the United States government does have these capacities that were built up for other purposes, principally through the Defense Department, Defense Production Act. And I think there are lessons that the United States could learn in the use of those instruments for broader purposes from Japan, which has been doing it all along. So that's not really an answer to your question, but that's something else that the United States could learn from Japan.
At least places to look, yeah. Definitely. Yep, in the back, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Taya Kemmer. I'm with the law firm Mayer Brown, and in the Biden administration, I served as Assistant Secretary for Export Administration. So I can help with Professor Echeverry's question, but I also, the reason I wanted to speak up is I wanted to pull on some of the threads of what Professor Friedberg proposed for a way forward. So Professor Echeverry, to your question, I would point to the Biden administration work on semiconductor manufacturing equipment just between Japan and the United States, but likely to be broader, such as with semiconductor manufacturing equipment, where the Netherlands have to be included in order for the measures to be successful. So I'd start there as a point. There are other examples. Professor Friedberg, I think you're referring back to COCOM during the Cold War period. COCOM turned into the Wassenaar Arrangement, which has had its ups and downs over the past few years, in large part because Russia is a member. But again, particularly with Japan's leadership at the G7 in Hiroshima, we had successful export controls imposed outside of Wassenaar, or to the side of Wassenaar. Some people call it Wassenaar -1, or consensus -1. And that was very effective, where countries came together to realize common, again, starting with common threat, and then moving to common action. So going back to your proposal, Professor Friedberg, I'm completely intrigued. And you know, the idea of moving beyond export controls, this idea of common tariffs, commonly identifying alternate sources of supply, and to your inkblot strategy, the idea of maybe moving forward beyond the semiconductor manufacturing equipment to these other measures. But again, I come back to the Trump administration focus on bilateral relationships and the thought that these kinds of things cannot happen without multilateral agreement. So without the excuse of perhaps running out of time, where do you come out on how we can build that multilateral arrangement, perhaps with Japan leadership like we saw in the G7? How do we do this, practically speaking, right now at this time in our history?
Yeah. Well, thank you for those examples and for that question. I should say I was being a good student in answering Professor Eichenberry's question literally, and so thinking about the Cold War. I do think there are some interesting examples in the post-Cold War period, and especially in the last 4 to 6 years. But they're examples of either bilateral or minilateral cooperation. And the semiconductor manufacturing equipment is one. And I think there are others where it is the case that only a relatively small number of advanced industrial democracies control the relevant technologies which China needs and is trying to get hold of, and where it would therefore be possible, as it did prove possible in semiconductors, to get cooperation among 2, 3, maybe a small handful of countries in order to impose effective controls. And that's what I would look for. I think there are some in aerospace, the materials, some relation to engine technology, where Japan hasn't been particularly a leader, but where the United States and a small number of other countries are. That's where I would start. And I would say also, I would start by looking at what the Chinese authorities themselves have identified as their choke points. And they've been quite explicit in talking about this almost immediately in 2018, when the United States began to move in this direction. The CCP regime geared up a sort of typically large but rather impressive analytical effort to identify a set of choke points. That's where I would begin, because they were looking at areas precisely that answered precisely to this description, where there were one or a small number of Western countries that could conceivably cut them off in ways that could be quite damaging. So that's my better answer to Professor Eichenberry's question and your useful comment. Thank you.
Any response to that, or?
No, I guess I would add quantum,
Right.
which is an area where it's not quite commercialized yet, but last year, new restrictions. To the point about multilateralism, you think we're bilateral and minilateral is successful, but not quite multilateral?
Well, I would have said we were headed towards some forms of multilateral cooperation. You mentioned Wassenaar -1 in the previous administration. And I don't know that that's absolutely impossible under the present administration. I'm not sure. I don't think, from what I can tell, that they are thinking in those terms. I guess part of the answer to this question depends on something which I don't know at this point, and that is, what is the overall approach of the current U.S. administration to China going to be? because if it is what one might have expected based on the first Trump administration, and if it were a linear extension of what the Biden administration was doing, then I would be quite confident that we would continue to move in this direction. I think that's actually where we were starting to go by the end of the Biden administration. And maybe we will wind up there. But at the moment, the U.S. policy is unclear and arguably is headed off in a variety of different directions. But if the current administration, in fact, in the end, turns out to be as worried about China as one might have expected based on comments of the president himself in the past and some officials, then this would have been plausible. This would have been the logical direction in which to move. I'm just not sure that that is still the case.
Okay, can I just...
Please, yes.
So just to channel my inner Trump administration. So if you look at the AI action plan that was released by the Trump administration earlier this year, when it came to controlling sensitive technologies, they pointed to aggressive deployment of the foreign direct product rule and secondary tariffs, which is sort of an odd throw-in in this, right? But to me, that just shows Trump administration is like, look, we can get all the cooperation we need with these really aggressive, just strong-arm tools. FDPR basically says that if Japan is incorporating any U.S. technology in the production of a product, we can go after them if they sell that product to somebody that we don't like. It's an extremely aggressive move that the Biden administration resisted using when it came to questions around export controls. And I also think, to the point that was made earlier about policy stability and to the point you just made about policy stability, I mean, it takes a lot of work to come up with a multilateral, plurilateral structure of export controls or any other complicated policy, and this administration, as we've seen, is willing to turn on a dime to pursue other objectives that are maybe completely tangential to whatever we're talking about. And to me, it's both a reason for why the Trump administration is not pursuing these approaches, but also a reason for why I don't think there's much maybe benefit for a really concerted effort by our trading partners to try to encourage that. Sorry.
Yes.
Just very quickly, thinking about what the current administration is doing and saying, it is really pointed in two directions simultaneously, which is what makes it so hard to interpret. On paper, what's been outlined and described is a very aggressive extension and expansion of policies that the Biden administration was pursuing. In practice, at least on TikTok and NVIDIA, the administration is going off at a complete tangent from what one would have expected based on Trump 1. Now the question is, which is the accurate predictor of the ultimate direction? It's possible that TikTok and NVIDIA are peculiar cases that have underlying explanations which have nothing to do with U.S. strategic interests, and then in the long run, what's on paper will in fact turn out to be the strategy. But I'm not sure that that's going to be the case.
Yes, please. No, Teruko, of course.
I just want to mention something about FDPR is mentioned. That's the very reason why I emphasize the importance of the alignment of the policies. I'm sure the FDPR is a very effective tool, and it has a very valid national security policy objective, which totally I respect. But at the same time, that kind of mechanism affect directly the Japanese companies who are doing business with the United States, and there should be some kind of effort, at least between the governments, to make sure there's not too much burden on the companies, and also there should be some kind of mechanism of the dialogue between businesses and the government so that you can come up with a practical but feasible mechanism that serves the policy objective. So I just want to emphasize that kind of dialogue between business and the government is crucial.
Oh, that's absolutely right. If I may, I think I want to put on the table one other thing, though, which is interesting that hasn't sort of been discussed. I'm glad you brought up AI. I was sort of shocked that we hadn't talked about it yet, which is, talking about the kind of tensions in all this. One thing that has really been striking to me is the Trump administration's move away from clean energy and how costly that will be for the United States in so many different ways, not only in terms of the existential threat of climate change, but in terms of the fact that China, as you were saying, is so good at these cheap scale economy production, right? So it's very different than the world of chips and AI and so on, where clearly there is a lot going on with the Trump administration, but this complete volte-face, about turn that the Trump administration has done strikes me as not in America's interest at all, and frankly, really dumb in so many different ways, right? And so I think there is this, fear amongst folks that follow the question of the green transition very closely, like my colleague Jonas Nam here at CISS Johns Hopkins, that there's no way that we can kind of stop buying these products from China, be it batteries as you were discussing, or solar panels or whatever, because there's no alternative. And again, the existential threat of climate change is so bad that that's the only way out. And when the Biden administration had set forth a very clear path to at least try to develop national capacity in those areas, that really, I'm still puzzled by, I guess the ideological commitment to sort of not talk about China, climate change perhaps, but that seems really bad. So, all right, more comments and questions. Sorry, who was, oh, please, yes. Yes, of course, yeah, use this, it's much easier.
About the returning to the multinationalism, I have a very naive question. So President Trump declared Liberation Day. Almost 6 months has passed. And not all the countries' negotiation has completed. So I think, I'm just wondering, bilateral negotiation with more than 100 countries is practical or not? I'm not sure, how do you think about this one?
I don't know, I can't answer that question. Do you want to channel your inner Trump administration? Or help us figure that one out?
My friends at USTR are very busy right now. I mean, they are very actually excited about the work that they're doing. I mean, by the time negotiations are done, I think we'll have a ruling from the Supreme Court on whether or not this emergency power, IEPA, can be used as a basis for tariffs. And so a lot of this might change. But I do think that, I mean, to that point, I do think that this trade policy is going to persist regardless of whether the Supreme Court strikes down the use of IEPA. I think USTR is quite ready to deploy other trade authorities that are much more tested. But I mean, the reality is, there's more progress than I would have expected in these bilateral conversations. Obviously, I don't think anybody expects any of these agreements to go to Congress to be ratified. It's going to be, which I don't know what that means for the future of trade policy, frankly. But it's a lot easier to get like a joint statement than it is to get, something set permanently. So maybe others in the room, especially the lawyers, have a better sense of what it means for our trade policy. But
Great questions.
That could be an example, or trade policy could be an example where the United States and others could sort of back into a cooperative policy with respect to China. So if the United States lowers the tariffs that it's threatening to impose or has imposed on some of its allies in exchange for their agreeing to raise barriers to goods from China, and that's of course already been discussed in the case of Vietnam, it's conceivable that we could wind up with something that sort of looks like what I referred to as a trade defense coalition in the bloodiest and messiest possible way, but that may be where we're going.
Other comments from our audience? Questions? Please.
I'm from METI, and now from JETRO. I have a question about China. So my concern is also the Chinese overcapacity issues. And I agree with your opinion that we need to install some kind of international rules or international regulations. But if international regulation or rules implemented, does Xi Jinping have intention to follow that kind of rules or regulation? Because Xi Jinping easily broke the promise. For example, with UK about Hong Kong. So I can't trust that Xi Jinping policies. How do you think about that?
I think that actually the overproduction phenomenon itself is really hurts Chinese economy now. And this current situation is very, very bad compared to the last overproduction period in 2015. Almost all the industry are now suffering from the overproduction, and the economy of China is really sluggish. So actually, they understand they need to cut their production capacity. But because of Trump, President Trump is so demanding. so President Xi cannot avoid state fighting pose. So they cannot stop investment over the manufacturing capacity. So this is very short-term issues. So I think, I think that it is now the good timing for U.S. and China are making some kind of deals. So if the United States correctly deal with this point, I think China may follow that. But the long-term commitment, I think for China, I think good designing of incentive is necessary. And I think that he is not schizophrenic, less schizophrenic than somebody else. So I think, that you provide some good incentive to commit to some agreement. I think China will follow for at least in the midterm, 5 or 6 years. So for Hong Kong, that hurts the sovereignty of the CCP. So that is a very first priority for China. So I think that, they be beyond that some very important point. But if you're talking about trade or something, it doesn't refer to their sovereignty or something. So in that case, they really are more calm and rational. So I think that is my opinion.
That's a very big question, and I'm curious if there are other folks on the panel. Aaron, do you want to take that up? And also Teriko? Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry to have to disagree, but I think there is very little chance that the current CCP regime is going to agree to any of the kinds of measures that might be required in order to alleviate the problems that have been created by their overcapacity, because I think that is a deliberate strategy on the part of the regime. It's a mistake, I think, to blame it on Trump. This has been the Chinese posture for some time. I don't think that it would be a waste of time, frankly, to pursue agreements that would impose limitations, in part because I don't think that they would agree. We've sort of seen that to be the case, but also because if they did agree, I wouldn't expect them to abide by them. And that's how we got into this problem, or how we have gotten into this problem over the last 20-some years. China has, in my view, manipulated and avoided the requirements that it agreed to adhere to when it entered the WTO, and this problem has now grown to be one of enormous magnitude. So I'm not optimistic about the possibilities of achieving some kind of negotiated agreement that would alleviate this problem, certainly not in the near term.
Thank you. I think this discussion relates to the proposal made by Professor Watanabe about the international competition law policy. I think that kind of effort is already kind of embedded in WTO regime, like anti-dumping or countervailing duties. They may not be functioning fully at this point, but if we can kind of improvise some kind of a mechanism closer to that kind of already existing anti-dumping duties or the countervailing duties on subsidies, because those are the tools used by those SOEs. So we can try to tweak the current already existing mechanisms and utilize them more. And also there was an effort among European government and US and Japan to a lot of efforts on overcapacity some years ago in steel production. And maybe we can visit that discussion again. I know it takes time. I know it's kind of difficult time for us to collaborate, but still there should be an effort.
So there are tools out there, but they do bump up against the sort of internal drivers of the Chinese regime, which push against that, perhaps. Jake, did you have a question? I thought I saw you. Nope. Raise your hand. Sorry. I will mention too, in listening to this conversation, a lot of my work looks at the European Union and the move towards industrial policy and geoeconomic approaches to markets. And one of the things that was so striking to me when that sort of began some years ago was that the EU was sort of the ultimate kind of competition, single market, pure version of competition. That was really what it was built on initially and going forward. And, Margaret Vestager, the competition policy chief, went after all these, American platform companies because of antitrust stuff and what have you. And it's been really fascinating to watch them sort of figure out exactly this. Well, how do we carve out within this system of sort of, nice kind of open markets capitalist system, how do we carve out to achieve these goals that we have? And they came up with this kind of brilliant strategy, I thought, politically brilliant, which was they took a term out of an existing treaty called Important Projects of Common European Interest, which said that, yes, states can use subsidies. Yes, you can have violations to sort of antitrust policies, and markets can actually be structured in a way towards goals other than perfect competition, if these are projects of common European interest, right? Important projects of common European interest. So it was a way of sort of, where we started of sort of setting out the goals, and it turns out, oops, they were mostly in like quantum computing and chips and everything to do with sort of national security and the green transition, critical minerals, all that kind of stuff. And so it was a way of sort of carving out and trying to, not throw the baby out with the bathwater, still have these kind of, positive mechanisms that come with open markets, but to kind of create these sort of spaces where the Europeans could come together and both internally and in terms of their sort of export controls and their investment screening and so on, really focus on what was important to them and modify markets and structure them for that reason, which was super interesting. Now, the EU is its own creature, whatever it is, not a sovereign state, not an international organization, but I think there might be some interesting lessons to be learned about how the broader communities of interest, what did you call them? Economic defense, what's the word?
Economic defense coalition.
There we go. Economic defense coalitions, might sort of mimic a little bit that kind of format. So that's my 2 cents on the EU. Sorry, what? Oh, we're going to close a little early? I think we were supposed to go till 11, but is that changed? Well, we can wrap up. That's fine. If there are, well, let me give the last word to the speakers. That's always interesting. Sort of our conversation, what do you think the audience should be left with in terms of kind of how to be thinking about this complex world that we're in? We'll go ahead and start with Chris.
Sure. So the thing we're watching right now, I woke up to news this morning. There's a breakthrough in U.S.-China trade talks. There's a real chance, I think, that we could see a big deal, and I'm not the first person to say this, between Xi and Trump. If, for instance, the fentanyl tariffs drop, the 20% fentanyl tariffs on China drop, then the effective tariff rate facing Chinese imports would be basically on par, if not a little bit lower, than other economies that could actually serve as credible alternatives for manufacturing, notably India, but also even Vietnam. And so I think we need to be very cognizant of looking back at the first Trump administration, we had big tariffs on China. China learned how to manage these tariffs, right? They're the most adept at dealing and helping US importers apply for exclusions. There really needs to be a relative gap in the Chinese tariff rate versus the rest of the world for there to be any sort of de-risking. And I am thinking more and more that we might be in a world where we're actually more dependent on China for certain things, depending on how this plays out. So I think that that's something to watch. But there's obviously still a real opportunity bilaterally, especially with Japan, I think, to build this economic relationship in some of these critical sectors that are going to be less salient to the president, but more important to the China hawks in the administration who still exercise a lot of sway.
I think the economic sanction in 2018 against Huawei made that company was very capable and innovative, and they invented the third operation system for the mobile phone. I think so. I can understand the problem, but we need to consider more carefully how to deal with the problem, and we need to think about how to manage the incentive, how to manage not just attacking the capacity, but we need to compromise how to incentive to violate something harmful for us.
Great, thank you. On to Aaron.
Yes, I haven't seen the news, but I can sort of guess where it may be going. In the first Trump administration, there was a sort of a division. On the one hand, USTR and other parts of the U.S. government were pursuing policies which were ostensibly intended to pressure China to modify its trade and industrial policies. It was a more aggressive or assertive pursuit of the same objectives that previous administrations had pursued through WTO litigation and so on the one hand. On the other, there was this eagerness for a deal, which reflected, I think, the president's own predilections. At the moment, it seems that any thought of trying to pressure China to change its policies or to defend our economy from those policies is at risk of the attraction of a deal. Because if you think what a deal would consist of, it would likely be commitments made by the CCP regime to buy more soybeans and a few other products that would not change in any fundamental way the trade and industrial policies that China is currently pursuing, which are creating these problems for us. So I worry that we may wind up going that route, which only means that these problems will get worse, which means we will have to address them at some point in the future from a position of even greater disadvantage than where we currently find ourselves. Because I agree, if there is going to be something like a collective effort, it's going to have to begin with a differential in the tariffs that are imposed on China versus other countries. The last thing I would say is, what have we learned since 2018? It's how skillful and adept Chinese companies have been in pursuing alternative approaches to getting their products into the U.S. market, transshipment and other mechanisms for introducing Chinese content into products that may be assembled in third locations. It's sort of surprising that it took us that long to figure out what was going on, and we haven't yet come up with an appropriate method of dealing with it. But that's the place, I think, where the effort needs to begin. And I do believe there are some people in the USTR who have, at least in the past, talked about the necessity of doing that kind of thing. But here, too, they may be pulling in a different direction than their boss.
Thank you. I'd like to conclude my speech today with my personal motto. My motto is, instead of complaining how dark the room is, light the candle. And this is a very challenging time, and we tend to finish our dinner talk in a very pessimistic note all the time nowadays. And we know we are in a very challenging time. But it is important to continue our dialogue, even among the people with the different ideas, different philosophy. It is important to continue to have a constructive discussion among each other and among the diverse stakeholders, so that we may eventually come up with some kind of a hint to improve the situation. So this kind of forum with diverse people gathering in the same room and it's a great way to encourage each other to make sure to keep the hope in the future. Thank
What
you.
a wonderful way to conclude. Light a candle, everyone, and let's go have some coffee. Thank you.